Here is Noodler's Turquoise, a turquoise ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is very blue leaning as a turquoise. So blue leaning that if I didn't know it was a turquoise, I would have thought blue. I was expecting a color more along the lines of what you're going to see in the lab notebook later in this video. There is some tone variation by pen and paper, so you need to choose a combination that's going to give you the tone that you want. It does shade some, but not enough to really distract from what looks blue and should be turquoise. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs well, but gives huge tone shifts that you can look like they're completely different inks depending on the paper. I can see returning to this as a blue, but not as a turquoise. And with that, I do hope that there's people out there that absolutely love this ink. But I'm not one of those people. I've been very disappointed with what I've seen as the majority. I hope there's people that really love this. The pen for today is a Pilot Vanishing Point. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. What we get is a very blue looking turquoise on the page here. Now it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. You can see some shading like the R at the end of your on the first line. In friends on the first line, the F starts a bit lighter. The R darkens a bit. The IE gets a bit lighter. The N a little darker. The D lightens up a little bit, but that S at the end does return to a darker tone. Unfortunately, almost all of this has been blue. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Oh, almost forgot to say it. Between the wiggling fingers. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Noodler's Black. Here is Noodler's Green. Here is Noodler's Purple. Here is Noodler's Red. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Here we get a much more of a blue-leaning turquoise, really heading towards what I would kind of expect when something says turquoise. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does have only light moments of shading that happen, like on casket on the first line. The E is a bit darker than the rest of the word, but for the most part, what you see is stuff like jewel on the second line, which is a single tone, not a horrible tone at that. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. This toned paper really did shift the color that we got from this ink from being blue on the Clairfontaine to being a blue-leaning turquoise on the Portage to being a green-leaning turquoise here on the National. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It doesn't give very much shading. There are a couple of moments you could spot, like white on the first line, where the WH are lighter than the I and the TE at the end get darker again. But this as a green-leaning turquoise, I don't think is too bad on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you can see this ink got very deep into the paper in a number of spots. Really kind of disappointing because this usually handles ink fairly well. We can see in some previous samples, it did good. The last video, not good. Here, not as good. No, I wouldn't write on the back of the page with as deep as it's getting. I just wouldn't risk it, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Here we see this stands out against the quad rule with no kind of problem. It is the same tone of blue that we had on the Clairfontaine, which is a shame because this is turquoise. Now it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does have some light peppering of shading throughout. You can see it like if you look at thick on the second line where the T is lighter than the H, it lightens a little bit with the I, darkens at the CK at the end. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our writing back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Montegrappa Turquoise. Here is Noodler's House Divided. Here is Noodler's Navajo Turquoise. Here is Noodler's Ottoman Azure. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Here we see this stand out still very well against the quad rule. We also get a kind of lighter blue leaning turquoise. The Clairfontaine, it was a very blue ink. Here it lightened, flattened it a whole bunch, really turned it into that blue leaning turquoise. And I think the color that we're getting on the page is the best, only to be followed by the National that gave that kind of green leaning. Totally different colors, but both of them were enjoyable. No feather, no spread, only a light peppering of shading that happened. You see it on him on the second line where the M got quite dark. Purchase on the first line where it's mostly one turn, but it's with the haste at the end that you start seeing some shading happen. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, there is no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can happily write notes back here. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Noodler's Bay State Cape Cod Cranberry. Here is Califolio Cannelle. Here is Noodler's Nightshade. Here is Noodler's Golden Brown. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. What we get here is a lighter in-tone version of what we had in the lab notebook. This is very much a turquoise ink, not the same at all as what we had on the Clairfontaine. Now it does feather and it does spread, but I don't think the feathering or the spreading are out of control in any kind of way. What I'm seeing is serviceable. You could use this and be very happy, and I think you're getting a great tone. There's a few moments of shading that go happen, but anytime you get an ink that writes well on copy paper, you kind of let it go at that. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we see that it gets quite deep into the paper in a lot of spots. So you couldn't write back here, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This dry writing, a medium nib Pilot Vanishing Point gives a very different tone on almost all papers. It does manage to give a little bit of shading though. Now off camera, I tried this in a very dry stub and the color became more turquoise and the shading improved. So to get this to be a turquoise and not blue, I would go for a dry writing pen with a broad or stub nib, but never a wet pen. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.